What if you could take that risk, make that change, reach that goal, live your best life? Welcome to another episode of the What If You Could podcast, where we get together with amazing experts and everyday people who share challenges, encourage healing, and explore the possibilities that life has to offer. I'm your host, Gary Scott, and I'm excited that you're along for the ride. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the What If You Could podcast. And with me today is a man who's going to help you fix yourself, fix your relationship, and we're going to start having sex again. Not he and I, but I'm just saying, if you have a significant other. So welcome, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
we're
have
we're,
some.
we're definitely not going to have sex, but yes, I'm hoping that many of the folks who are watching this might discover that things can get going again. That certainly is part of what I've written about.
Well, that's what we're gonna go for. We're gonna help some people because, well, I'm gonna read your intro and people will know what we're talking about, and then we're gonna get into it because this is good stuff. And man, is it crucial. And we'll get into that in a second. So, anyways, hey guys, so Dr. Bruce Chalmer is a psychologist in Vermont who has been working with couples for over 30 years. Through his teaching, consulting, writing, podcasts, and videos about relationships, his ideas have helped thousands of couples and their therapists. Dr. Chalmer is the author of three books: Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn Trust Again, which was published just recently, 2024. It's Not About Communication, Why Everything We Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong, published in 2022, and Regaining the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back, published in 2020. With his amazing wife, educator Julie Alexander, Dr. Chalmer hosts a couples therapy in 7 words podcast. His notable interests include musical composition, especially Jewish themes, choral singing, and directing. Now, his composition, I'm going to hack this bad, so you can correct me later.
Brachot.
What is it?
Brachot, probably. That's what I think you're
His
talking about
composition,
that.
Barak Hoch, a midrash. Yeah, you're gonna tell us that.
A midrash cantata, right?
Yes, it's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a frittata, but without the eggs. It's
You
very
could say
simple.
that, yes.
In any case, welcome, Dr. Sharma. This is going to be fun. I mean, we know that relationships are wicked bad. I don't know, 68% of relationships end in divorce, except in California, I think it's 92%. Um, and so welcome. But because we're the What If You Could podcast, I just have one question out the gate. And it would be if you had a what if you could moment that brought you to this, or if there's a what if you could you'd love to share with us, what would that be if you wouldn't mind
Sure.
sharing that?
Yeah, I suppose that I could boil it down to this. What if you could go through the stuff that, if you're old enough, you've probably gone through some kind of hurt, betrayal, painful relationship stuff. What if you could go through something like that and emerge out the other side with a renewed sense, even a better sense of faith, and often even a better relationship than you had before? What if you could do that? I guess that's how I would characterize that.
Well, we're gonna have to go to you on that one because I don't know. I mean, like I said, I've never been through divorce. My first wife passed unfortunately 10 years ago from cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wow.
It's been 10 years and I'm almost getting through it. I
Hmm.
have remarried, and it's been very difficult being remarried.
Hmm.
So I mean, what do you think? I mean, how do we get there in relationships, and why that one book intrigues me so much? I love the sex book, but the middle one, why is communication not valid? I mean, what'd you write that book, and what the heck
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
about?
Yeah, it's a pretty snarky title, isn't it?
I like
It's just, in
snarky.
fact, for the benefit of folks who may be actually watching the video, I'm holding up the book now. It's not about communication, why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. So, why do I write a book with a snarky title like that? Well, starts off by recognizing that I don't know what the percentage is, I've never really counted, but a substantial majority of couples who make an appointment with me in the first session or even before, if they're writing about what they want to talk about, they're saying, well, we want to communicate better. Of course they do. I'm not trying to say, oh, no, you don't. Of course they do. That's how they'll say it. It's like, well, if we could only communicate better, every time we try to bring up something, it ends up in a fight or a deep freeze, or we just can't seem to communicate. We need to learn some tools to communicate. That's what they're saying. And I understand that. It's not like that's a bizarre thing to say. But it turns out, I realized over the course of working with folks, I realized that most of the folks I work with are actually very capable of communication. The vast majority of people I work with. Now, what do we mean by very capable of communication? Well, let me talk about the rare exceptions. The rare exceptions are people, for example, well, literally, I've met folks who literally do not speak the same language much. There's that, folks who meet and they fall in love, but they barely, like one of them, if they're talking to me, they're at least one of them's fluent in English because what are they talking to me for? Um, but the other one may not be, right? So there, and that'll come up. Those are interesting. Those are communications issues. It's like, oh, you don't quite understand what's being said to each other because you don't literally speak the same language. Fair enough. You can learn, usually what happens when somebody comes to this country and marries somebody whose first language is English, they usually over time they get better at English, but still there could be some communication issues. That's a communication issue. Folks on the autistic spectrum, occasionally, like what they used to call Asperger's, although they don't use that term as much anymore because it was kind of, it just wasn't as well defined as the diagnostician people like. But some folks with Asperger's, one of the defining characteristics there is they're not very good at detecting whether the person they're talking to is pissed off at them, happy with them. They're not very good at reading emotion. And so that can cause communication issues. They'll be misinterpreting, what somebody is intending, and it's sort of the stuff that's underneath what's being said explicitly. So those are communication issues. Everybody else typically is very good at communicating. The problem isn't that they don't know how to communicate. The problem is what they are communicating. What they are communicating often is anger, mistrust, um, hopelessness, all sorts of things. They're communicating very clearly, but of course, if that's what people are getting from each other in the relationship, that sucks. That's not going to feel good. So it's not that they need tools to communicate. And the interesting thing is what if you think about the way a couple that is doing well, however you want to define doing well, we all have our own definitions, I suppose. When I think of a couple that is doing well, if you were to be a fly on the wall, so to speak, observing them communicating, you would note that they are following certain procedures, certain rules. They're, for example, they're not insulting each other. They're not, they're saying things in terms of, well, this is what I'd like, this is what I'm preference, but I want to hear from you too. They're doing all the stuff that when people teach communication rules, that's what they teach. They say, well, if a well-functioning couple mostly communicates in these ways, why don't we teach you to communicate in those ways and you will become a well-functioning couple? And that turns out to be, I'm not sure what your language code is here, but I will say bullshit. Is that okay to say on your?
You can totally say bullshit, Doc,
Thank you. Appreciate it.
because you have to call out people's bullshit every once in a while,
I,
right?
I think so, yeah. And
You
and
have
I
to.
say this with great, I say this with
All love and tenderness.
compassion. Yeah, I mean, it's like, no, it's bullshit. It turns out teaching somebody to behave the way well-functioning couples behave doesn't make you a well-functioning couple. They're behaving that way because they're functioning well. They're not functioning well because they're behaving that way. My one of my analogies, I actually mentioned it in the book, and you can tell me if it's too lame an analogy, but I like it. You know how I was thinking of this with like Rafael Nadal, Rafa, when he's playing tennis. And when he hits the ball, like so many of the elite players do, he grunts loudly. He does this big grunt when he hits the ball. So I guess those of us who aren't elite players, all we have to do is learn how to grunt, and then we'll be much better players, right?
Yeah.
Turns out not. Turns out that is not the case. That behaving the way well-functioning couples behave is a function of their doing well. It's not, there's a fallacy. What is it called? This brings out my nerdy side. The post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. I read that somewhere.
What the hell was that?
Yeah, post hoc ergo propter hoc. It means
Oh, sure. Everyone knows
because
that
it
one.
happens after, therefore it happens because.
Ah, okay.
Well, that's a fallacy. It's not necessarily true.
Mhm.
So that's what I mean by saying, if you think learning communications rules is going to help you communicate better, it typically doesn't. You can learn all the rules. They're not bad ideas, by the way. The rules aren't bad ideas. They're descriptions of how a well-functioning couple behaves. But learning to do that isn't going to make you function well. You actually have to function well by not being so damn pissed off. If you're not pissed off at each other, you will then communicate in ways that convey that, and then things will go a lot better.
So is this the Venus and Mars thing? Is the communication because we are not on the same wavelength to communicate, or is it, you know, I mean, no one, we don't all communicate the same way, right? I mean,
That
we
is
just
certainly
don't.
true.
I mean, so, well, like you're saying, I mean, I'm a great communicator. My wife's a Gemini. She's an outstanding communicator, but sometimes we don't communicate well together
Yeah.
because we're just on the different wavelengths, I guess.
Yeah, because it is certainly, of course, the Venus and Mars thing is one way of doing it. And there is a lot of stuff, and a lot of it is sort of fits in the common sense realm. It's like, hey, turns out men and women are often different. Who knew? What a surprise,
No shit.
Gosh,
Seriously.
wow. Um,
Well,
and
not anymore.
in
They're
ways,
not, Doc. You can't go there.
say again?
Not anymore. They're not. You can't go there. Men and women
Well,
are
you
this.
know
Yeah.
what? That was I've noticed this over the last 30 years or so that I've been doing this, in private practice. And I've noticed it started to get a little easier. Maybe I'm just a compulsive optimist. It started to get a little easier to note that stuff than it was 25 years ago. So certainly in gatherings of therapists, it started to get easier because for a long time it's like, oh my God, if you had that thought, it's like you'd be written out. No, no, you couldn't possibly think that there are any essential differences between men and women. I mean, there's enormous overlap and there's enormous variation within each gender, but some characteristic differences, turns out it's true. And I always love to point out those differences aren't bugs, they're features. Do you know what I mean? This
They're not
it's
what? What was that?
they're not. That's like what Microsoft used to say when you would say, "Why does this damn software do this?" And they would say, "That's not a bug, that's a feature." We intend that. The difference between men and women
I'm
isn't a
going to use
bug.
that with my wife tonight
Oh,
when she,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm going to say, honey, it's not a bug, it's a feature. That's like an addition
Yes.
add-on. You're
But
getting
of
a
course,
bonus.
in using it with your wife, I mean, of course, what I would say is no, first use it with yourself, which is to say, notice that stuff that it in her that seems like, why doesn't she understand me? Why does she think so? Why do those women think so differently than us men? Yeah, start by recognizing, that stuff. I'm taking a wild stab here that you're heterosexual. But that appears to be the case from the
It
fact that
just depends what day of the week it is. You
depends
know,
on what day of the week. Yeah, no, most folks, it's fairly clear. And given that you're heterosexual, that's that feminine stuff you love, the stuff that turns you on, that's the same stuff as those communications differences. The annoying communications differences, it's founded in the same differences that turns you on. It's the flip side of the same coin. The fact
walk
that,
walk
yeah,
walk me through that. Walk me through
yeah,
that because
yeah.
it's so. Are you saying so? For example, men sometimes, historically, are want sex more, just wham bam, thank you ma'am, three pumps and a shiver, and
Hmm.
women, they need to warm up, they want romance, there's a little of this, right? And
Yes.
so are you saying that part of that, where that little rub there, is that what you're talking about
That's
with that?
that's a
Walk
great
me through that,
example.
because that
And
intrigued me now. Nothing you've
I
said
think
so
that's a
far
great.
has, except that.
No, that is a totally. So wait a minute. Say that again.
So yeah, walk me through that.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fabulous example. That, for example, the fact that, and of course, as you sort of noted, it isn't always true that men want more sex than women. I've worked with lots and lots of couples where it's the other way around. So there's a lot of variation there.
Yeah.
Having said that, yeah, that tendency for men to be much quicker about it. Like we're much quicker to get going and much coming and going literally, and take that in whatever sense you want, coming literally and figuratively. We're quicker usually than women are. I will say parenthetically, just yesterday I was talking with a couple. It was fascinating because they had that sort of pattern where the man wanted sex a lot more often than the woman would sort of do it because she knew it made him happy. But oh, by the way, when we started talking about it, she mentioned, and it's like uncomfortable for her to talk about sex, but she said, "Oh, by the way, I can actually have by myself, I can have an orgasm in about a minute." It's like, whoa, that's unusual for women. And it's like, yeah, she figured out how to do that as a kid. And it's kind of amazing. Anyway, you never know what you're going to find when you actually start talking about this stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But no, that very point though, if you think of it in evolutionary terms, what would make a man interested in sex and what would make a woman interested in sex? Well, if you look at the ramifications of having sex for our species, yeah, this is pretty pretty obvious stuff. I'll look it up in my notes, but I believe it's the women who get pregnant, if I'm not
You
mistaken.
know, it depends if you
Even
live in
that,
California, no. It is
that's right.
not the
Even that is uncertain. But in general, it's the women who get pregnant. And so, what is it? If you think just very stereotypically, right? What are the stereotypical things that turn a man on, and the stereotypical things that turn a woman on? Stereotypical thing that turn a man on, to be crass about it, are tits and ass, right? Why tits and ass? Because that's superficial indication that this person might be fertile. She's got a wide enough hips that she can give birth to a baby without dying, and she's got breasts that indicate that not even accurately, by the way, but whatever, that seem to indicate that she could feed that baby. So a man's attracted to that. It's like, oh, good, reproduction opportunity. Bingo. What's a woman attracted to? Stereotypically, muscles and money. Why? Well, because it has to do with providing and protecting. Makes sense because our species, unlike many other mammal species, our species gives birth to helpless young because we made the mistake, and I think about this every time my hip or my knees hurt. We made the mistake of getting up on our hind legs. I'm still pissed off at that decision, but somewhere back, a million or so years ago, we decided to get up on our hind legs, and we've been paying the price ever since. Well, especially if we go and live as long as I've lived. I'm in my 70s now. It's like, no, we weren't designed for that. But I'm not, don't get me wrong, I enjoy it, but really weren't designed for that. But the point being, when we got up on our hind legs, hip structure had to change. And so the only way women survive birth is giving birth to a little baby. Little meaning helpless. Unlike, look what happens when a horse gives birth. A mare gives birth, the foal comes out, and they're running in a few hours. So it's very different. So because of that, and not only that, but she doesn't have fur anymore for the baby to hang on to. So basically, women's hands are tied up with babies, and they need help. And who I'm channeling right now is somebody who just died fairly recently, Helen Fisher. Do you know that name? She was an anthropologist who wrote a lot about the sort of the anthropology of sex and mating practices, and she wrote a lot about that stuff. And I learned a lot by reading her. I never met her. Just died a few months ago. Anyway, so that phenomenon that women are turned on differently than men are, that's a feature, not a bug, as I say, right? That's like, yeah, that there's good reason for that. So if you want her to want sex with you, she's not going to be turned on by what turns you on. And it's amazing how many guys just don't get that. The guy will go and grab her ass thinking, well, if she would do that to me, that would be kind of cool. And she's thinking, excuse me, I'm
I'm
in the
making
middle. I've got
dinner.
17 things that need doing that you haven't paid any attention to, and you're expecting me to get all turned on because you just grabbed my ass. And we guys just don't get it. To the extent that we learn to get it, it doesn't mean we should turn into women, which generally speaking, women don't want us to, believe it or not. Sometimes you get that idea. Sometimes, this is another thing that, 25 years ago, I would sometimes get the sense that what women were looking for is a girlfriend with a penis. And we're not going to
But you
be
can get
that.
that now.
And yeah, and it turns you can get that now. Well, actually, it's interesting how gay guys can be great friends to heterosexual women, precisely because they're not after them, and they're still men. They can still offer a male perspective. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But that phenomenon of her wanting a heterosexual woman wanting a girlfriend with a penis, she really doesn't. She just wishes the guy wouldn't be so clueless with respect to what she needs. And
Are
when we
and are
learn,
is it are men just men are more visual and women are more emotional.
usually, yeah, again, there's exceptions, but yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, nothing's dyed in the wool
Yeah,
100%. But I mean,
yeah.
a woman, your wife gets out of the shower for the 9,000th time. You've seen your wife get out of the shower 9,000 times, right? And you
Hmm.
still look at her going, man, wow, how much time do I have before work, right?
Yeah, yeah.
She watches you get out of the shower and she's like, yeah. Jesus, I gotta do laundry. I gotta go. I gotta
Yeah.
get make your breakfast. I gotta make your lunch for work.
Yeah. Which is why, you hear, you've probably heard this kind of thing before. If you want to know where foreplay starts, doing the dishes is fabulous foreplay. I mean, things that the sort of thing where she perceives that she's glad to have you in her life because you've just made her tasks easier. To the extent that she keeps having that experience, often what you'll find is she's all about turning you on. She's delighted to keep you. Now, that doesn't always work wonderfully. There's all kinds of variations there, but the basic ideas there are, those differences we were talking about. That's what I was saying, that they're features, not bugs. The stuff that heterosexual men, and I'm one too, that heterosexual men are drawn to, the femininity stuff is often tied up with the same kind of sensibility that means she's not just going to be able to jump in the sack. She's going to be aware of surroundings and aware of the emotional climate that's going on in the home in ways that men tend not to be.
But I screwed up here because this is what I do. I scroll all the time. I accidentally turned us to your first book about sex, which I totally want to get into, but I still want to get on this communication thing. I think
Yeah,
I accidentally scrolled you away from that because immediately
fine.
guys start talking about sex. But
Yeah. Funny how we'll go right there, won't we?
right, it was easy. Well, you said tits and ass, and we were right down
There we were.
the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Um, but you said a couple things about the communication. You talked about the patterns that we see. And
Hmm.
you also talked about the self, talking to yourself and getting yourself straight. So when
Hmm.
you're working with people who are struggling with communication to each other, although they're great communicators with a girlfriend, he's great communicator with his buddies at the bar or
Yeah.
whatever. But when they're communicating together, does it starts with the self? It starts with the patterns in us, or
Well,
you
so
started
let me
down
give
that
you
for
one
a
of
second.
my, I'll give you one of my favorite. I almost always give this little talk in the first session with a couple. And in fact, the book you're referring to, it's not that book, it's not about communication. One of the latter chapters is actually, I think I call it couples therapy under the hood. What I describe is exactly what I tend to do. I say tend, yeah, there's exceptions, but what I almost always do in a first session. And first sessions for me are the only ones that are particularly structured this way. After that, it's more like improv. I read about that too. Like improv theater. Improv theater. Have you ever done that, or you familiar with
Oh
it?
yeah.
You have. Great. So you probably. I'll bet you've done it more than I have. I've done it very little, but I had several of my kids actually were heavily involved in theater and did a lot of that.
Yeah.
And improv, the one rule of improv is yes and. Remember that? In other words, no matter what ridiculous thing is presented to you, you never reject it. You never say yes, but. You
Yeah.
always say, I'm going with that. And then you add
Yep.
something maybe even more ridiculous, but whatever. It's always
Yes.
yes and. When people come to see me, they're not in yes and mode at all. They're in no damn it mode. That's where they're at. And when I like to describe the process after the first session, the process of couples therapy is a lot about inviting people into that space of yes and. Certainly that's where I have to start is, wow, that's interesting, as opposed to, oh no, you can't think that way. It's like being willing to go into those places. This is what you're thinking. This is what you're feeling. You can talk about that and not have it thrown back in your face, at least by me. Your partner's going to do it, but I don't have to. And eventually it can invite them into that. But anyway, let me talk about that for a session because it's related to what you're asking about. So in the first session, again, using the improv metaphor, you know how any improv scene has to have a premise. It has to have a setup. It's like, okay, you're a couple and you've been on your car broke down, and this guy comes along and he gives you a ride and they ask you a bunch of weird questions. Go, you know.
Yeah.
That, of course, by the way, my wife suggested that when I was writing the book. That's basically, if you think about that, that's the setup for couples therapy. Like you broke down, this guy shows up and he starts asking a bunch of weird questions. That's couples therapy, right? So, so what's the
I
setup?
love
In other
that.
words, the first session is all about the setup. So this this is part of what I talk about always. I give a little intro to this particular concept in the first session. What I talk about is what are the needs you're trying to fulfill by being in a couple? Why do we do this? Why do human beings do what we do? What's the point? Yes, we reproduce sexually, but You like you're in a second marriage. I'm going to take a wild guess. I can't, I don't know exactly how old you are, but I bet you're not having more kids.
We are not having more kids.
Yeah,
We don't
just a
even
wild
want a
guess.
pet.
There you go. But so why? But why do we couple up? I'm also in a second marriage, by the way. I mean, the short story of my first marriage is both my ex and I went on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier. That's that's the story of my first marriage, and
Good for
we all get
her.
along. It's great. I love her wife. She's great. Anyway, so the point being, why would I go on to want to get married again, even though I was well past any interest in having kids? Well, because there's other things we're after. And there's many ways of describing it, but my favorite way is to say there's two sets of needs we're trying to fulfill: stability and intimacy. I'm claiming those are both needs that if they're not adequately fulfilled, something feels sick, something feels off, it ain't working. So the reason I divide it into those two sets, stability and intimacy, is that the skills you need for stability are very different from the skills you need for intimacy, and yet they're both needs. In fact, they're kind of in tension with each other, but they're both needs. So let me just talk briefly about each one. Stability, when I say stability, it just means, you're not freaking out all the time. You're not worried. Stability means, of course, things aren't shaky. So if you wake up in the morning and you're not worried about your relationship, it feels stable. It's that simple. What are the skills of stability? They're all skills about keeping the anxiety level relatively low. So, you show up when you say you're going to show up, generally speaking, sober, that helps with stability. Lack thereof is very destabilizing often. I don't mean to trivialize that, but
Yeah.
that is destabilizing. Um, you basically you don't abuse each other. You act in ways that are within the norms of whatever it is the you and your spouse are expecting. You basically don't keep throwing curveballs at each other. You learn over time what somebody's buttons are, and you more or less try not to press them. That's all stability stuff. Makes sense. It's an important thing. Nothing wrong with stability. And in fact, most of the folks who consult me, outpatient therapists, they're usually pretty stable in that sense. Somebody who's dealing with somebody's like schizophrenic or something like that, or some have bipolar, having a manic episode, hugely destabilizing stuff. Most of the folks I work with aren't nuts, and I point that out. By the way, I say that to folks. I said, well, now that I've known you for 20 minutes and we're old buddies, I guess I could say this to you too. Pretty clearly, I don't know you very well, but I can pretty well tell you're not batshit crazy, right?
Eh.
And everybody says that. Everybody says you haven't seen me on a bad day. And again, I don't mean to trivialize, serious mental health
uh,
issues, because if they are, that is what in 30 years there've been a few times when I haven't said that because somebody was crazy, and that's really painful. But most of the folks who are consulting me, they're not crazy. It's not about crazy. They might feel the other one is, but it's not about insanity. It's not about, oh my God, your sense of reality is like totally messed up. It's not that usually. So generally speaking, they're pretty good at stability. So what's the problem then? Well, intimacy generally is what they're there to talk about. Now, here I better define my term, because people use the term intimacy. It doesn't just mean sex. I mean that in a broader sense. Intimacy, one way of defining intimacy, as I think about it, is intimacy is when you can be fundamentally present and honest with yourself and each other at the same time. You're present in the sense of, you're not dissociating, you're not flying off somewhere else in your mind. And you're basically honest. I say basically honest. Look, to be honest with myself, undoubtedly, I have a bunch of mixed feelings. So it's not like I only feel one way about something, but I can know that. That's what I mean by being honest with myself. And I can express it in some way or other to my partner that's what I mean by intimacy. If I feel I can do that and I do that and I can listen to her and she can do that, those are moments of intimacy. And, I was talking about stability, and the chief skills of stability are all about keeping the anxiety level low. The chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety rather than avoiding it. That's the chief skill of intimacy.
let's repeat that again because that's really
Yes.
good.
That's a key point. You notice how I slowed down and verbally underlined it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's why I thought let's repeat that because that's really
Yeah.
good.
The chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety rather than avoiding it.
Mm.
And, people will often look at me funny, like, well, I thought intimacy was supposed to feel good. Well, of course it does when it does, right? Intimacy feels great. Like if you're having great sex, I guess if I'm calling it great sex, by definition, it means it feels good. When it feels good, or a lovely conversation or a lovely moment of, oh, what a beautiful sunset and we're enjoying it together. That's great. I'm not knocking that. But I'm observing that intimacy also involves times, for example, when you want to bring up something as simple as a garden variety complaint. You want to say to your partner, you know, I wish you do more X, Y, or Z, or I wish you would do less X, Y, or Z. It's like I want to issue a complaint here. I wish you'd do
Do you
something
have to make it a
different.
formal written complaint sometimes, or can you just
Yeah, with consult your lawyer and get it in writing. And no, I mean it's it sounds silly, right? But the point is, you to intimacy involves often a moment like that. It's like you want to bring up something, and of course, it's not just complaints; it's also things like fantasies, desires, and that could be in the sexual domain, of course, but it could be just in the general life domain. I've been thinking. I'm kind of scared to tell you this, but I've been thinking I really want us to move overseas for 6 months just to see what that's like. And I'm worried if I say that to you, you'll freak out, or in the sexual domain, even more, oh, I want to try fill in the blanks with your favorite kinky thing. And I'm worried that if I say that, even if I say I'm interested in that, you're going to think I'm some kind of pervert or something. To be able to say what's on your mind in a way that feels like you're not going to be totally rejected is scary. And notice, I'm not talking about perfect emotional safety here. What I'm claiming is that any two human beings in a close enough relationship are going to have some differences, some of which will be a little scary to bring up. And what stable couples tend to do, especially when they do bizarre things like get married and have children. I often point out, by the way, to the couples I work with, I say, there's your problem. You not only had children, but you actually give a shit about them. See, that's the problem. You actually give a shit about your children. Then what you discover is all of a sudden you have all these worries. If you don't, if you had kids, we just, when I suggest to people, I say, well, just give up your kids for adoption. What's the problem? They look at me funny. For some odd reason, they look at me funny.
seems
So,
easy enough to me? I don't,
oh
yeah.
yeah, it's no biggie there. No, obviously that's absurd. The point being, when you love someone, it particularly is scary to bring up something that feels like it might rock the boat. And so stable couples will often avoid rocking the boat. And the that first book I talked about, it's not just about sex, but of course it implies that. Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Couples Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back. That's that book. I should hold that up for the benefit of
Hold
folks
that one up
who are
too.
watching it. Yep, there it is. Oops.
Angle it a little bit so that it's not so bright. So we can read. There you go.
That
Yeah,
better? All right.
perfect. Perfect.
Yep.
So reigniting the spike. Why stable relationships lack intimacy and how to get it back.
Yeah.
Reigniting the
And
spark. Okay.
reigniting the spark. And the point is that the business about why stable relationships lose intimacy, that's what I'm talking about, because they will often avoid bringing up stuff that is too scary to bring up. And the effect of that tends to be destabilizing because if you avoid intimacy, because that's basically avoiding intimacy, you're shutting down part of yourself. If you avoid intimacy, that itself becomes destabilizing. My favorite metaphor about that is if you think about a living plant, an organism, a living organism gets planted, a seed gets planted in fertile soil, and it sprouts and it starts to grow. Somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. What will it do? Well, it will try and crack the sidewalk, and we've all seen plants growing through cracked sidewalks. It'll try, or it'll die trying, but it won't just sit there. Because if you think about metaphorically, that plant, the roots are all about stability. It needs roots, or it'll just blow over in the breezes. But intimacy is the energy for growth. Living organisms need to grow, need to interact. And I am claiming, and this isn't, I don't think, a terribly controversial claim. Individuals, we're individual organisms, but a couple is a living organism as well. More than the sum of its parts. It functions as a living organism. And if intimacy gets shut down, if that couple can't feel that sense of growth, then it will become destabilizing. Someone will try and crack that sidewalk. And what does it look like to crack the sidewalk? Well, there's a variety of ways people do it. One way is to have an affair. It's not the only reason people have affairs. I don't mean to oversimplify, but it's a biggie, certainly. And we'll get to that if we talk about my book about betrayal, I suppose.
Definitely. Yeah.
But another thing that happens is they will fight about everything and anything except what they're really worried about. Because the fight is often a very useful way. And, people aren't doing this consciously, but it's a useful way of avoiding actually saying, oh shit, you're scaring me. It's like, oh my God, I want to say this to you, and you're freaking out at my saying it, and you're freaking out because you're inferring something, then maybe it's legit, you know? If somebody is saying, I'm again in the sexual domain, somebody's saying, you know what, I think I'm realizing I might be gay, or I might be bi and I'm missing, whatever, or I want to try something that you don't seem to have any interest in, but I'm really driven toward that. Or, it's not just a gay or straight that gets people in that can become a deal breaker sometimes. I met a couple, early on in my practice, so this is decades ago now, where the woman had figured out see, when I met them, I think they were in their 50s. She said in her 30s, she had figured out that she's a submissive. It was so interesting because this person was a take no prisoners. I think she was a lawyer or something like that. The sort of person that's like, oh my God, and in real life, it's like, you don't want to mess with her. She'll tear you a new one.
Yeah.
She had figured out she's a sexual submissive. And what she needed from her husband wasn't merely to be dominated, she needed to be humiliated.
Mhm.
And he was the big gruff guy, that you'd think he could do it. His heart wasn't in it. He loved her and he couldn't imagine wanting to
Don't
humiliate her.
don't you
Yeah,
don't you seem to find that in your practice though that I don't want to squirrel off in this direction, but don't you find that in your practice a lot of times where it is that person in power, the CEO who's in power all the time, has to be in charge,
absolutely.
ends up seeing a mistress who is a
Exactly.
dominatrix,
Dominatrix. Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because at some point it feels good to not have to be in power and run shit all the time, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
anyways,
that
I
it
squirreled off of
happens,
that, but sorry.
it's fascinating how varied people are in that domain and other domains too,
So
So
where does trust play into this with the
ah,
communication thing? I mean, as far as it's so scary. I mean, with my first wife, she was 18, I was 21. We grew up together. There were no secrets. We
mm,
went there and back with everything for the 28 years we were together before she passed. And, raising the kids, had a business together. So it was super easy. Right. I mean, there weren't any secrets. We grew up together. We didn't have any different history. So you
yeah.
get in the second marriage, I'm like, dude, you got a freaking cargo ship full of baggage. Holy crap. How are we gonna dissect all this? How am I gonna I don't feel safe with you knowing your history and you know my history, which is totally limited, right? One gal in 28 years.
Hmm.
Um, so there was a lot of trust issues there with me.
Yeah.
And then when the communication, because we're amazing communicators, we just bring it because we're like, well, shit, we got nothing to lose. I'm
I
62,
mean,
you're 55, you've been married 3 times. We got nothing to lose. We're just gonna lay it out, right? I don't care.
and
You
not for
can leave.
nothing are you doing a podcast, right? You're a communicator. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Just so we both communicate really well, but still, there's a lot of trust issues, and there's a lot of things you have to be You feel you need to be careful sharing because of trust.
Yeah. Well, and that I think you've put your finger right on it. The trust issue is because of the anxiety, because you don't know how your partner's going to receive it. And you're worried because, it's somebody who's super important to you. And so to share, and again, it's not always like explicit secret, but just to share how you're thinking or feeling about something can seem scary. And the effect of that is to curtail anxiety. I mean, not curtail anxiety, to curtail intimacy. And so the general, and it's sort of an overgeneral statement. The general statement on how to maintain and foster intimacy is to tolerate that anxiety. It's like, wow, this is scary, but I'm going to bring it up. And that is tricky. It's a hard thing, and what often it involves for folks, because what happens because of the fear, if it crosses over into panic, then you're not thinking at all anymore. You're basically, who I like to shout out to at this point is a woman called Jill Bolte Taylor. Do you know that name? Jill, Bolte is her middle name, Jill Bolte Taylor. She is a neuroscientist. She did the very first video that went viral as a TED Talk. She wasn't the first TED Talk. It was one of the first ones. I think it was like number 8 or 9 or something. But it was the first one that went viral back in 2007, 2008, something like that. And she's fascinating. I like to invoke her when I'm talking about this because she, as a neuroscientist, when she was in her 30s, she had a massive left hemisphere hemorrhagic stroke. And who better than a neuroscientist to go through that, given that she recovered. It took her years to recover. Left hemisphere is like where all the language and logic stuff is, more or less. And so she was without that for a long time. She got it back to the extent that she could then give TED Talks and write books and things. And she wrote about it. She wrote about her experience being without that. It was fascinating. And her first book was called My Stroke of Insight, which is also the title of it's a great title. It's also the title of her TED Talk and well worth checking out if you haven't checked it out. My Stroke of Insight, it's had millions of views. It's very well known. And she wrote that a book based on that not that long after the TED Talk. And then just fairly recently, about 4 or 5 years ago, she came out with a book called Whole Brain Living. And her basic thesis, and she's very whimsical in how she writes about it. Her basic thesis is that we're all walking around as four different people, at least
We're all walking around what?
as four different people. We're all four different
Four
people
different people. Okay.
at the same time, and she's not talking about dissociative identity disorder, multiple personalities. That's a whole different thing. But, everybody, and she's basing it on four different brain structures, left and right hemispheres, and then the upper portion and the midbrain. So that makes four different characters, she calls them, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And she
Mhm.
suggests we should all get to know our four characters and give them funny names. I asked this, Judy, my wife, I asked her when I was reading the book. She hadn't read the book, but I was explaining this. I said, "What would you call your four characters?" She immediately said, "John, Paul, George, and Ringo, of course." You know, and I really like that because it's sort of like what made the Beatles so amazing was they did sort of represent those four different kinds of characters, more or less. It's like, wow, Ringo's the one who he just wants to have fun,
Yeah.
and George is the one who's sort of tied into the universe, and those are both right hemisphere things, and left hemisphere things are much more logical and
Yeah.
anyway,
Writing the
it's
music, putting it together. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. The left hemisphere midbrain one, the left hemisphere amygdala really is the one that freaks the fuck out. That's the one that freaks out. And we need this function. And you can't banish it. It's the smoke detector, right? It's the one that says anything that reminds me of something that was dangerous at all in my life, that's where it's going to be emergency, emergency, and everything. It's going to take over everything. You get two people in there. Well, I think she calls that one character two, if I'm remembering right. You get two people in their character two trying to talk to each other. They're not talking to each other. They're just screaming. They're basically saying panic, 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 and then the other one's responding with panic, 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 and you get nowhere. So her Jill Bolte Taylor's idea around this is you learn to have what she calls a brain huddle, where you learn to the other three parts can kind of calm down character two when it's freaking out. And character two's got, it's an important part of the story, but you just don't want it running the show all the time. So how does that translate into what we were talking about before? Well, the way you're able to talk about scary things is by calming yourself enough. You won't eliminate the anxiety because you have it for good reason. You're not crazy to have it, but calming yourself sufficiently so that you don't panic. Now, I'll throw in another prop here. This is our merch from our podcast. Our podcast is called, whoops, there
Yeah.
it is.
Turn it a little bit.
Yeah.
There you go.
But
Okay, cool.
couples
Seven
therapy in 7 words. And
couples
here are the
therapies
seven
with seven
words.
words.
Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Now, why do I
By the
say,
way, we can find that on Dr. Chalmers' website,
you certainly can?
which we'll
Yes.
post later.
Now, where did that little slogan come from? Well, I realized early on, the origin story of that is a colleague of mine on the way out of we were doing a consultation meeting, bunch of therapists sitting around talking about folks we were working with, just to get some feedback from each other. And on the way out, we're literally walking out of the office, and he says, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" Which he knew was a silly question. How am I supposed to answer that on the way out the door? But I had been given it some thought. I said, if I really boiled it all down, I suppose what I'm telling people is be kind and don't panic. Don't panic because then you can't be kind. And by kind, I don't just mean be nice, which of course let's all be nice, but I mean be kin. Recognize your kinship. It's like, hey, we are on the same team. We don't always understand each other, but we're on the same team here. Well, you can't do that when you're in a panic. So originally it was 5 words: be kind and don't panic. But then folks would say, wow, that's a good idea. Tell me, how do I not panic? It's like, oh shit, how do I not panic? That's not so simple. And I don't have a simple formula for how to not panic, but I have a description of it. Have faith is when you're not panicking. In other words, when you have faith that, and what do I mean by faith? I'm not talking necessarily about religious faith, although religious faith often fits this, but often doesn't, frankly. Depends on, I differentiate between faith and fundamentalism, actually. To me, fundamentalism is the opposite of faith. That the sense of certainty that I know for sure, and this is what it is, and nothing else is right, and I have to defend the truth, that ideological certainty, that's the opposite of faith. Faith is when you're saying, I don't know. I have radical humility. I'm not God. I don't control it all. The faith is that this whole existence business is somehow right to be what it is. With that, then I can say, well, this sucks. I'm not saying it doesn't suck. It sucks, but there's got to be some way that this whole existence business is right. And there's death too, but there's something right about that too. It's like, yeah, you kind of have to accept that. When you can accept that with not merely accept it grudgingly, but accept it and say, there's rightness about it. You know what religious folks would say? Well, that means you're saying that God, whatever God means, God is good. I'm saying, yeah, whatever it's basically good. Is there evil in the world? Of course. And there's, all the philosophers and theologians argue about, well, why would a good God let there be evil? And the usual answer is free will. And I like, that's fine. But I'm just thinking in much more simplistic terms. It's like if I approach the world that it's basically good, things are going to go better, even though I may not always be able to solve whatever problem I'm solving. I'll do the best I can. And doing the best I can is good.
Hmm.
And most folks are trying to do that. It's interesting when I talk about ideas versus ideologies, that's one of my big things. An ideological approach says, I know what truth is. And if you don't think that, you're full of shit and you must be crazy.
Right.
And, it's interesting. You had a guest on who was saying that half the people know the truth and the other half the people are idiots. And with respect, I mean, I know the feeling. We all know the feeling. But with respect, that attitude is part of the problem, not part of the solution. It can't be true that half the people are crazy. It simply can't be true. Whichever side of like the political divide you're on, it can't be true that the other side is crazy. It just can't. I'm sorry. I don't know how to define crazy if that's true. It isn't true. There are crazy folks, but they are
Yep.
quite few. Most of us are just doing the best we can, and we come up with different understandings because we have different experiences and different frames of reference. And I'm by the way, I'm not saying I'm not trying to be a moral relativist. I'm not saying, oh, there's no such thing as right and wrong. No, I think there are things that I uphold. There are principles that I would uphold. There are things I would intervene with violently if necessary, to prevent certain kinds of harm happening. It's not that I'm opposed to that. I'm not a pacifist, for example. But I also think that a large degree of intellectual and moral humility is necessary. It's like, you know what? I don't have a direct line to God, neither do you. We're both doing the best we can. And if you disagree with me, you probably got good reason, and maybe I'll learn something from you. Maybe you'll learn something from me. That's a very different kind of attitude. That's an attitude of faith. That's the
I
opposite of
think
fundamental.
faith and reality go hand in hand too, because sometimes you just have to look at the reality of a situation, right? We're facing bankruptcy. We're looking at divorce. Our child has cancer. I mean, there's certain realities that you have to face,
Oh
and then
yeah,
you have to have faith that you can get through those realities. It's
yeah.
like, I my wife passed from cancer, so of course when I got cancer, my kids were panicked because to them
Oh
cancer
yeah,
meant death, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
but the reality was the situation was I had a very different cancer.
Hmm.
So when they're looking at me going, Dad, you're just not being realistic, right? You're not
Mm.
facing what's going on here. And I'm like, look, guys, no, no, no. I'm very realistic about what cancer is. I just have faith that mine is different. And I believe that what medicine is doing with this will get me through, which
Yeah.
it did. I wasn't just ignoring it. They're like, well, you're just ignoring it. You're just like,
Mhm.
oh, this is no, 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 no. I had faith that what I had, with the reality I was facing was going to be okay, or it wasn't,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
But
that is
you know,
that phenomenon that your kids were wanting you to sort of face the facts, and you were saying, well, you are facing the facts, but you're seeing different facts.
yes.
That of course is very common. And I will also note, just in general, the world needs optimists and pessimists, or we wouldn't have them.
Yeah.
It's like you need some folks, and I'll share a personal experience that we've been going through. My son, I mentioned we're a second marriage. I have three, and my wife has two. My youngest son um, was in this bizarre climbing accident, doing all the right stuff. It was this really bizarre. He's a rock climber. He was doing. He's also a professional musician. Anyway, he was in this. He was climbing, and they're actually doing a safety training thing. It was fall training. He was properly belayed. He didn't fall, but this boulder just suddenly dislodged from above him and hit him in the head. And he was in a coma for a number of weeks. He's now. This happened about 3 months ago. He's been making amazing progress that nobody could have predicted. And we're hopeful that he's going to make as full a recovery as he can. It's amazing. But
Wow.
what that takes, it's just fascinating among those of us who love him that, my wife and I tend to be on the damn it, we're going to be optimistic side. But there's some folks in the family, great, lovely folks who love him every bit as much as we do, they were all on the you got to face facts side. And I'm thinking, you know what? You kind of need both of those points of view to be able to cope with this. If we had been crazily optimistic, we wouldn't have been, helping make plans for, oh my God, how's my daughter-in-law and the kids, how are they going to function and whatever. She's doing amazingly, by the way. If this had to happen to anybody, she's well equipped to handle it, even though it shouldn't happen to anybody. But it's about that sense of even the idea that your kids would be saying, "Oh, Dad, you're not facing facts," and you're saying, "Well, I'm facing different facts." I think both of those points of view have a place, and see, that's kind of my point. A perspective of faith would say that even the differences have good reason for being there, and you have to work with them rather than insist that they go away. And that again is the difference between ideas and ideology. Ideas open up other ideas. Ideologies shut them down.
Yeah.
So when you get two ideologues talking to each other, they're not talking to each other, they're talking at each other. When you get two people who have, strongly held ideas, actually exchanging ideas, you get growth. That's intimacy. That's what I mean by intimacy. When you have a couple that is actually able to face that anxiety of dealing with those differences without banishing them, without insisting that the other person be like you, then you get growth. And that can be beautiful. It's an amazing thing.
I want to go back to the communication part and
Mm.
about the trust, the communication. I don't want to say who the person is, but in one of her marriages, you know, it was a really, it was a nasty sort of communication, and I didn't understand that. My first wife and I had the ideal marriage, if there's such a thing. We were just best friends, everything. I don't know why, um, but it just seems to me when I talk to some people and stuff that because they do have a challenge communicating, there's a they don't fight fair.
Mhm.
It's they know what buttons to push. So it's an intentional kind of pain. Like I want to hurt them like a kid. Like, I like this girl, so I'm going to pull her hair. I
Yeah.
like this boy, so I'm going to throw a rock at him.
Mhm.
It's like intentionally hurting someone because you're just so frustrated you can't communicate, right? I mean,
Yeah.
how do you get people to stop wanting to hurt each other like that?
Let me note sometimes, I mean, I don't like to, leap to nasty conclusions, but there are folks sometimes where you realize, oh my God, this isn't going to work because your view of the world is such that you're just an asshole. I mean, I don't,
Let's
I
face
rarely,
facts.
yeah, I rarely like to leap to, and it's funny because that doesn't sound like a very faith-based statement, does it? I rarely like to leap to that conclusion, but sometimes that's the problem. It's like, oh, I've met very few people like that over the course of my 30 years in, private practice, but a few where it's like, oh, probably you don't want to stay married to this person. or be in a relationship with this person because they're just kind of a dickhead. They seem to get off on hurting people. You look, there are folks who will attract a diagnosis of being like a psychopath or a sociopath. There's some technical
Or a
experts.
narcissist, a heavy narcissist too.
Yeah, and that one is a much trendier term these days, a heavy narcissist. But it just basically, however you want to define it, it's somebody like it seems like they don't seem to be oriented to actually giving a shit about you. And
Yeah.
that's just very painful to try and be in a relationship like that. So, those don't work very well. Even those, it's interesting, even those, I find, even those kinds of situations, I find that it works better for the person who's trying to be involved with them if they calm themselves down first. Do you know what I mean? What happens often, the panic is such that they can't even see them they're being abused
Mhm.
because they'll be thinking there must be a way to, because the person's been nice to them sometimes. So there must be a way for it to be okay. It's very difficult for somebody to, wrap their head around, oh my God, the problem here is I'm dealing with someone who really doesn't seem to have my best interest at heart at all. That there's just no room for me in this. I better get out because it's just not safe. It's hard to conclude that when you're in a panic. Again, panic has its place. But to actually be able to make a considered decision that says, wow, I got to find a way out of this, even in cases where somebody's, in physical danger, to be able to figure out how to make a safety plan requires that your brain be working. And it's hard to do that when you're in total panic.
Yeah, I mean, do you find that just the saying you hear a lot is just hurt people tend to hurt people, and then
Yeah.
that person is like, I'd love to help you guys together. I'd love to try to fix this marriage or fix this relationship, but shit, dude, you're so messed up. You need to get help before I can piece you guys together. I
Yeah.
mean, are there
Yeah. I
times
mean,
where you just go, look, you're so damaged, I can't fix the two of you.
that's not, I don't usually think of it that way. Do you know what I mean? It's like that way makes sense. But that way doesn't usually help much in a couples therapy scenario, seems to me. It's not that it isn't true, you know what I mean? That does come up. It seems to work better when people conclude that themselves. Do you know what I mean? Rather than me ganging up with, let's say it's the guy who's being the dick, which is not always true, as you know. I'm sure you realize women could be, we're mixing metaphors there, but women could be dicks
Right.
too. You know,
Can women be a dick?
can
I
women
don't
be a
know,
dick? I don't
but
know.
we don't want to use the see you next Tuesday because that'll just get us both in
No,
tons of
no, no, no.
trouble.
We're
Yeah, we
not going
can't
there.
go there. So,
Yeah, but it just means, yeah, I mean, we're all capable. Look,
yeah,
that is another survival thing. We have to be capable of being jerks.
yeah,
It's not pretty, but aggression is part of a survival skill. And men do it, women do it, and women do it characteristically different from men, but we're all capable of being jerks
yeah.
and are on occasion. But
See, but it's
rather
unfair
than,
because women will be called a bitch. Oh, she's just a bitch,
yeah,
and a guy
yeah,
will be called, well, he's just being a dude, right? And
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's just abusive towards some people.
yeah,
And sometimes she is a bitch, and and sometimes he's a complete jerk
yeah.
narcissist. But it seems that we pigeonhole people, and usually the gal gets the raw end of that deal.
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, those I think men do too sometimes. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? It's like, yeah. Again, my stance on that tends to be more about like, exactly what you said. That pigeonholing is the problem. When I talk about it's the same thing that I have a couple of chapters in that communication book about ideas versus ideologies. Ideologies are where you're pigeonholing. Ideologies are when ideas harden. They might even be good ideas, but when they harden into an ideology you have to defend as the ideology, then you're not listening anymore. You're not recognizing. Here's another little statement, oddly enough, of faith. It's the same. This is a corollary to my statement that says most people aren't nuts, even if they thoroughly disagree with me. I don't think they're nuts. I just don't. Well, the corollary to that is anybody's brilliant ideas are always not perfect. They just aren't perfect. I have one of my many favorite examples of this. If you think about the whole debate around abortion, there are actually many different views of abortion. It's not just two. But when they get hardened into, okay, we're pro-life and we're pro-choice, and those terms are chosen carefully to exclude the other side, what both of those terms are stressing is, well, the other side causes harm and my side does good. And both sides ignore the fact that it turns out that both sides sometimes cause harm and both sides sometimes cause good. And shit, what do you do with that? Turns out
It
to be
comes back to what
complex.
you were saying earlier. There's no absolutes. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to have both sides of every issue, and you can't make someone bad. You're what you're saying is bad. You're completely bad, and I'm good on this. It just
Yeah.
doesn't work that way. Just like
It
you were
just
saying
doesn't
earlier, it
work.
just doesn't
Yeah.
work that way.
And in couples therapy, of course, it doesn't work at all. That's why I tend to avoid this sense of, oh, I see, you're fucked up and she's okay, or vice versa. It's like, no, it doesn't work. And it took me a while in practice, especially as a guy, right? As a, heterosexual male, right? Took me a while in practice to not be especially pissed off at the guys. Why would I be especially pissed off at the guys? Well, because I see me in him, and it's the parts of me I don't like. So
Yeah.
I better not like him, and I've gotten better at that. It's like probably because I'm less pissed off at myself, I suppose, Like, okay, I know what it's like to be a dick.
Yeah.
I try not to be. I don't like to be. I think I'm less so for knowing that.
Yeah.
And but I know what that's like,
Well, it goes back to like what you said, looking at yourself. I mean, you have to look at yourself and be honest and go, dude, you're a dick. I mean, I'm sorry, you just are.
yeah,
My wife's second, third, fourth, I don't know, remember which husband is my current wife, but it's like the dude was just a dick and she just
yeah,
didn't see it. She worshiped him on this pedestal, and everyone around her was saying, babe, he's a dick. And the
yeah.
marriage lasts 9 months because he was a dick. Um,
Yeah,
but there's
but
sometimes
she
you,
wasn't crazy either. Do you see
what's
what I mean?
that?
She wasn't crazy either, right?
No.
If she you get into that, she had her. I'm not saying they were. It turned out good. It turned out good that they split up from the sound of it, but her being attracted to him wasn't insane.
No.
That's part of the deal. It's like, yeah, isn't life interesting?
And on a
Yeah,
lot of levels, they worked. I mean, that's the thing.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
the thing about people and relationships. It's like when my wife passed away, I immediately got engaged. Like 4 months later, people were freaking horrified, Doc. They were like, "Holy shit!" And they hated the other gal. And the other gal was awesome. Had we met in another time in life, we probably would have gotten married.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
but I was just so damaged, and so people were so pissed at her, and I'm like, why are you mad at her and not me? I'm the one. And they go, well, she shouldn't have accepted it. Your wife just died after 28 years.
yeah.
Um, and they're mad at her. Anyways, it crashed and burned. We're still friends. I still adore her to death, and I
Uh-huh.
feel bad for what I did, but we're still really close friends. I adore her.
Well,
She's the
and
funniest person in the world. So then I dated three other gals. That's it,
mhm,
and then I got married because I'm a
yeah,
relationship guy.
yeah.
But but the thing of the matter is, all all three of those gals that I dated and the one I was engaged to, we all had a piece that was awesome, that
Hmm.
worked, that we
Well,
could have
you wouldn't
made
have had a
everything.
second date if that wasn't true, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't that whole crash and burn thing only lasted 9 months because they really had a lot of things that could have worked.
Hmm.
But then there was one thing that was just too big. And fortunately, she got the hell out of there. But it comes back to what you were saying earlier. We're not all bad. We're not all good.
Hmm.
You have to get those pieces of that. And I really want to get to that to your current book, but I just have two quick questions since we're on the
Sure.
sex thing because I like sex a lot. With my wife only. Um,
I
the
approve. Not that you need my approval, but I
well,
approve.
you're a dot. If you don't approve, I'm screwed. I mean, shit. I got nobody if I can't go to you. So on the intimacy thing and the locking down and the losing the compatibility, losing the sexual compatibility, losing that trust in sex. Um, it doesn't have to happen in a 40-year marriage. I've seen it happen to people who've been together a year. I mean,
Oh yeah,
where does that? Is it because it was too hot and heavy out the gate? I mean, where do we see that splinter
yeah.
with that?
I'll tell you some an author who influenced me a lot, who unfortunately died a few years ago when he was only in his early 70s. And since I'm in my early 70s, I'm thinking, geez, that's young. Didn't used to be when I was a kid, but it is now. His name is David Schnarch. It's a funny
Oh yeah,
last name, Schnerch. Have you heard of him? Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So he would give lectures. He wrote a lot about sex. I think he didn't call himself a sex therapist, but couples therapist who talked a lot about sex.
Yeah.
So he would give lectures and he would ask folks, okay, at what age do you think people reach, men and women respectively, reach their sexual peak? And what would be the usual answers from the audience? It's,
28 for
well,
women, 40, 12 year old for boys, 28-year-old for women.
Right. It was always men younger than women, right? Right.
Yeah.
Inevitably. And he would say, of course, it was a trick question because he would say, "No, I think," said David Schnarch, "I think both men and women reach their sexual peak in their 60s and 70s." What? How could that be true? You're obviously not talking about sexual gymnastics. You know what I mean? You can't get into certain positions when you reach a certain age unless you've really trained at it for a long time. It's not about that. It's not even about hormone levels, right? I mean, menopausal women, the hormones change, and men as we get older, right? Our testosterone levels drop. So it couldn't be about that. What is it about? It's about maturity. And in particular, he's one of the ones who would talk about that notion of tolerating the anxiety of desire. It's a form of anxiety to be able to let that build and not freak out, to be able to tolerate that sense. That's hard. And that's what it takes is maturity. So the notion of, for a sex life to be really passionate, it is not at all limited to just the first, year or 18 months or whatever it is they say. Indeed, the hormones involved are different for the first, the limerence period, I think somebody defined it as. It's different hormones. It was vasopressin and dopamine and stuff like that. And later on, you get the oxytocin, you get the sense of real bonding, the bonding stuff, but that doesn't have to preclude sexual passion at all. But what that requires is a tolerance of anxiety, which is to say, let yourself desire what you might, even if it isn't politically correct.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean you'd act out on somebody without their consent at all. It does mean you'd be willing to let yourself know what you like or don't like, and maybe even share that with your partner. That's often a really scary thing to do. So,
Yeah.
and of course, to manage what we were talking about earlier, to manage those differences, those characteristic differences between men and women, from the male perspective, which is what we are, from the male perspective, it means learning how to be patient some. It's like, yeah, it isn't just about wham bam, thank you, ma'am. It is actually about learning patience. And the neat thing for us is what's in it for us is, wow, it turns out to be a lot better for us too if we
Yeah.
learn that.
Well, but like what the guy was saying, my wife died at 26, my first wife, so I had no experience with menopause. And then
Mm.
when I started dating, I was 50 and I dated women older than me. I did not want to date a 30-year-old or 35-year-old. All my friends were like, "Hey dude, now you can." I'm like, "I've got zero interest in someone with a nose ring and purple hair. I'm not I want to go older." And so I met some great gals, great intimacy, a lot of fun, and they were, mid 50s, close to 60.
Sure.
When I didn't still didn't understand menopause because it was dating. It was, so when I met my wife, she was just starting menopause and it was starting to really kick in. So,
Mhm.
being the rabbit hole guy that I am, now I have to get 57 books on menopause.
Uh-huh.
She's in recovery. She never minds me sharing this. She's 21 years sober. When we first met, and she told me that, I had to know everything about AA and about,
Sure.
because that's just how my brain worked.
Yeah.
So it was so interesting looking into menopause. And it was so interesting about the hormones and how the change and stuff like that. And so she was so discouraged and depressed about, love life and her desires and things like that and hot flashes and stuff like that. And I said, "Babe, here's the good news. You're going to come out of this like a raging teenager. You're not going to be worried about getting pregnant. You're going to be free. You're going to be able to
Mhm.
express what you want. You're going to be able to tell me what you like. We're going to be able to slow things down. Um, and we're going to be able to communicate on what works and what doesn't work with our bodies the way they are." I'm old too, man. And so the menopause thing was really interesting. And I think why he's saying that, and I believe it to be true, that as you get into your 60s, intimacy can be a lot better.
Absolutely, because look, we learn about all kinds of things, including sex. It's nice to know we're always learning until we're done, We're always learning, and part of learning, and it's sort of interesting, and this might be a segue into the betrayal thing, believe it or not. We'll
Good.
see if
I
this
want to go
goes
there
there.
next.
Yeah, yeah, let's see if this goes there. Oh, you know what? Before we leave the other stuff, I do want to say a word about my subtitle of the communication book. Why everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. because it ties into some stuff we've talked about. I just want to mention that. It's a snarky title and a snarky subtitle, right? Why would I say why everything you know? That
I
sounds
love
pretty arrogant.
snarky. No, I love
I do
snarky.
too. And I'm trying to say, no, I'm trying to claim intellectual humility here. I'm not trying to be arrogant, saying, no, everything you know is wrong. Because I point out in the book, in one of the last chapters, spoiler alert, I say, you know what? Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong too, which is to say, it's not that I don't have ideas about it. It's that if I claim to know them, in other words, if I get ideological about it, if I say, well, this is how it works and everything else is bullshit, that's wrong. That's the part that's wrong. It's the certainty that is wrong. If I claim certainty, that the arrogance of certainty gets us into huge amounts of trouble. So that's what I meant really by that subtitle. It's like, well, you know what? Everything you know about couples therapy is wrong. Hey, me too. Isn't that cool? But I'll bet you've got some good ideas. And I've got a bunch of good ideas I'm claiming are good because I do have a lot of experience with this. And I've thought about it a lot. Try these on. But I don't claim they're the truth. I claim they may be some good ideas. I'm kind of interested to hear yours because I'll bet we'll both learn something. So,
Man, I love the arrogance of certainty.
yeah,
Wow, I love that saying. I mean, is that not like the best saying for the world we're in right now?
well, that's certainly what I claim. Absolutely. Yes. That's the
Right?
whole point. The, all of the political divides. And look, I'm old enough to remember, but so are you probably. I mean, I'm what am I? You said you're 62, so I'll be 74 in May, so I'm like 12 years older. You're old enough to remember this when, well, my parents, I remember in 1960, you probably don't remember that because you weren't quite born yet. The 1960 election was Kennedy versus Nixon. My father voted for Nixon, my mother voted for Kennedy, and they laughed about it. It wasn't like, oh my God, I can't be with you. It's like, isn't that funny? They said, I'm leaning this way, I'm leaning that way. Okay, cool. Nobody gave a shit. I mean, yes, they did give a shit. It's not like it wasn't like big and important, but it wasn't the sort of thing like, oh my God, I can't associate with you if you're on the other side. And that's how we've become a lot. And I'm saying, well, that's the problem, not the solution. The
Yeah.
problem isn't convince the other side that they're all idiots. The problem is to recognize, no, actually, they are idiots, but I am too. We're all idiots. So let's calm down and try and get a little smarter. See
Well,
what we can do.
because like, I mean, like you've repeated over and over, and I keep repeating it for you. I mean, there's just no 100% right, 100% wrong. It's just not. The world doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah,
It's just not how things are, and that's why I love the arrogance of certainty because everyone's so freaking arrogant about their certainties right
yeah,
now, and you are absolutely a complete idiot if you don't agree with 100% of exactly what I say. There's
yeah.
no gray area here. I
And
am right
often,
and you're wrong. And because
often
you're
worse
wrong.
than an idiot, often you're evil.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh,
Which
no,
is
you're
like, oh
definitely
boy,
evil.
then it gets really nasty. And so it's like, ooh boy,
So
that we need to get past that.
how does that relate to oh I just had one other thought on this
Sure.
communication before we go. Um so how do we roll that into, the relationship of I mean, if someone is just raised a certain way and they're like, this is how marriage has got to be, and this is how I want my wife to be, and da blah 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 blah, and the woman, this guy was raised a freaking Mormon, and this girl was raised a hippie, and her parents went to Woodstock, and they're still smoking weed and have braids, and this
Yeah.
guy's, Mr. Straight Lace, and it's like,
I've met couples like that. I have totally met couples like that. Yeah.
so what do you do with them? Just go, you guys are done.
It's funny. The longer I've done this work, the less I even in my mind predict how they're going to do. Because I know, I don't think I mentioned this, but before my career as a psychologist, well, before I got a PhD in psychology, I actually got a master's in statistics. So I'm an old statistician in the background. Actually, my first book actually was written in 1986. It was a introduction to statistics. It was called Understanding Statistics. It's still
That's a
available.
great book to read just before bed, like when you
Oh
can't
yeah, I mean,
sleep.
it'll put you right out. It's still available on Amazon. I was amazed at it. It's like it's available on Amazon. The hardcover comes with a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk with some software on it. No, there's no machine in the
That's
world that will read
awesome.
it. Anyway, whatever.
That's
But the
awesome.
point is, my statistician brain says, you know what? I don't bother predicting how a couple's going to do because I think I'm wrong worse than chance. I think
Yeah.
I'm apt to be wrong about that. You never know the odd couple types. You never know. They sometimes work out fine and they sometimes don't.
Well, remember, I think his name's James Carville. and he's a
Yes.
he's a
And
hardcore
Mary Madeline.
lefty.
Yeah.
And then what was her name? Mary Matlin
Mary
or
Madeline. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
Mary, and she was a total righty, and he's a
Yeah.
total lefty. And
Yeah.
you'd see them fighting on TV. You go, this is great. This is great theater. And I
And they
think
made a
they're
marriage
still
out of it.
married.
They still are.
It's like
Absolutely.
40
Yes.
years, right? I mean, so it can
It's a
work.
while. Yeah.
Yeah, because he was a Clinton guy, so they were together
Yes. And she
before
was a
that.
Bush
So
guy. Yeah.
it's got to be a long ass time. So one more question, and then I want to go to betrayal because who doesn't love betrayal? Um, the it's getting juicier. It's getting
Yeah,
juicier by the
really.
minute. Um, Stupid term, but I'm going to throw it out there because you're a therapist and you trust me, and we're in a safe space. Um, Soulmates.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
Is there
Look, I
such
don't call it a stupid
such
term.
a thing?
It's a limited term, right? It's a sometimes misleading term. It's like if you think soulmate means there's only one person in the world who could possibly be the right person for you, that's a dangerous concept to a marriage because what tends to happen is you discover after you have these connections. And look, I'm all about the Yiddish word is beschert. My wife and I we say we were
Yeah.
beschert. I mean, I won't. If you go to our podcast, one of our relatively early episodes, at least during the first year, because we've been doing it now for coming up on 5 years. One of the first episodes we tell, or one of the early episodes we tell our story, like how we got together, and it was Bashert. That's the thing. And
I've
and
actually
that's
heard
a
that
lovely.
term because my grandfather on another part of the family is Yiddish. So you were either
Uh,
Bashtuk, like she was with her husband, or you're Meshuggah. Everybody
uh,
was Meshuggah.
everyone's
Everybody
Meshuggah,
was
right?
Meshuggah. It
Meshuggah,
didn't
right?
matter who it was. They were Meshuggah.
So anyway, the point being that the soulmate concept, the problem you run into, of course, is you find your soulmate. Well, that's beautiful. I'm an old romantic. That's lovely. You find your soulmate, and then you discover after after the smoke clears of the first few months, and you start to actually see that there's another human being over there, not just your image, not just what you're projecting. You discover, oh, wait a minute, they're not exactly as you thought they were. There are some differences there that are different from your idealized image. And now you're in trouble because it's like, oh my God, are they really my soulmate? And that's a what a burden on someone, to have to be exactly what you want all the time. It's just no human being is going to live up to that. So it's a problematic concept. There was I should remember the guy's name and I don't. There was a guy who wrote an article, a book actually, and I remember reading an article that was based on the book. Anyway, the point was his basic thesis. I think the title of the article or the book was "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person," and and he's not a cynic with respect to marriage at all. He's just saying when you pick out somebody, you're picking out the particular set of annoyances that go with that person and you're stuck with that. And when you celebrate that and relax about it, then you'll be fine. And this is actually something that we took up in a podcast a few months ago, where we actually had a guest who didn't show up, and they had an emergency. It turned out a last minute emergency. So my wife and I were sitting there saying, "Well, we want to make a podcast this week, so let's go ahead and do." And I said, "Oh, I know." We're going to make a podcast on the one ability that solves all relationship problems. Not too arrogant, right? Just a little, not too arrogant. My wife
Yeah.
looks at me and say, "Oh, really? Yeah, yeah, right." So we did this. And so what is it? I will drum roll, please. I will tell your audience what the one ability that solves. Notice I'm saying all relationship problems, politics, war, couple relationships, anything. It is the ability to be mildly annoyed. That is the ability. And it's because what does that mean? If you think about it, it's kind of the opposite of the soulmate idea. It's like, oh my God, of course you're annoying. The one thing I know about me, God knows it's true of me. I don't think it's not nearly as true of my wife. It's definitely true of me, as I'm annoying as hell. She's very gracious about dealing with how annoying I am, and that's why we work well together because she's really nice. She doesn't annoy me, but I annoy the hell out of her. I'm sure I do, but she's really gracious about it, so we do fine. Now I'm being slightly silly because I'll bet she annoys me on some level, but you know what I'm saying? I don't think of it that way. It doesn't seem like, she still feels like my soulmate. We are deeply in love. She still feels like my soulmate, and it doesn't matter that sometimes she does things that are funny or that
Doc, I tell my wife 3 times a day, you annoy the shit out of me. Yeah, I swear to God, you're the you're the most selfish person I know. She goes, I know, but you love me, and the fact of the matter is, I'm even more selfish than she is.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
So
Which, by the
so
way,
that's what makes me laugh about it. But it's just like, geez, whether it's driving or whether it's cooking. I mean, I have to redo the dishwasher every time she loads. I'm like, ugh, who loads a dishwasher like that? Did you see what you just did? You
I've
know,
met couples who've come to the brink of divorce over loading the dishwasher. I've heard that one before. So anyway, but there's just that concept that no, of course anybody is going to have some things that are, a little bit, there's going to be a little friction. Some of the heat comes from the friction, right? And that's how that
yeah,
works. So,
yeah. So when it comes to the friction, and
yes.
we're having friction, and so I don't like you anymore. And there's this new hottie at the office that always wears a short skirt and bends over when she makes photocopies. Do people
Yep.
make photocopies anymore? We
Geez,
don't
I
call them
don't know.
Xerox. I don't
I
know.
don't even know.
So
I haven't made one
so
in ages.
you go out for a drink with the new person to try to be nice, and the next thing, bada bing, bada boom, you're in the sack, and it's
Yep.
great, and you feel young again. You start losing weight, and you go into the gym, and you're dyeing your hair, and you get wear buy a sports coat. And your wife goes, "What the hell's going on with you?"
Hmm.
Um, I mean, social media has blown up cheating hard. I mean, so your book is called Betrayal and Forgiveness: How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. That
There it
one.
is. Yep.
You know what I noticed too is your first books, the covers,
Uh-huh.
are all cartoony and pretty and colory and nice. And this one's black. It's
Yeah.
like black and red and harsh.
Well, and I used a different designer for this one. Actually, all
Yeah.
three of them had different designers, but I really like what she came up with.
Oh,
We went
yeah.
back and forth on a few, but yes, she captured that notion of betrayal and forgiveness, and you see
And
the
forgiveness.
the
Yeah.
plant growing up from forgiveness into the betrayal. I really.
So how do we go from betrayal to forgiveness? Because that's a really tough thing. I mean, do you ever truly, honestly forgive and trust again, or you
Yeah,
just can't?
that's what I wrote my book about. Yeah. Uh, first of all, it ain't simple. That's why I wrote a book about it. That's why I did. That's why I don't have a 7-word slogan that says, "Oh, here's what you
Right.
need."
There's no coffee mug for this one, guys.
There's no coffee mug for this one. There's a book, but there's no coffee mug. Look, frankly, there's tons of books, right? There's a lot of approaches to this. So, do you ever really truly forgive? Well, that depends on what you mean by forgive. And I do talk actually, very specifically about how I like to think about the concept of forgiving and how I don't like to think of it. So that's a great place to start from. What do you do? First of all, put yourself in the position of that wife you just described who she just found out, oh my God, he's been cheating. And, we're assuming here their deal, of course, is monogamy. It's actually cheating. It's not like, well, you gave me a hall pass. Nope, no hall pass. This is cheating. So she's devastated. And she's, of course, not only devastated because she's pissed as hell that he would betray her that way, she's also scared. She doesn't know what her life is going to look like. She doesn't know, if she loses her husband, she loses a lot of the aspects of her life that, she's banking on. What if they have kids? What if, all the things that, couples get into. So it's not no surprise here. It's a huge upheaval when that happens. So getting past that initial phase of just shock is part of the recovery process. You're going to have to go through, it's a trauma. You're going to be freaked out when you think about it for a while. You're going to have to find some way of being able to think about it without totally going into freak out mode. That takes some time. Therapy can be helpful for that. Friends can be helpful or not helpful. Actually, therapy can be helpful or not helpful, depending on how it goes. What you don't want are people telling you what to do in either direction because it doesn't do you a damn bit of good. And of course, your friends will do that because they care about you. And so it's like your wife's friends, when she was with that other guy, telling her she should split up. That wasn't what helped her split up. Maybe it helped a little, who knows? She already knew they thought that. That
Didn't help
wasn't
at
what
all.
did it.
She's too stubborn.
Yeah, she had to figure it out. And what you need in terms of friends and therapists, by the way, are people who will respect you, respect that it's difficult for you, and help you think clearly. They won't tell you what to do because they shouldn't think they know what to do. That's the other issue. That, by the way, is kind of a central feature of how I like to practice when I'm doing well. I can't always pull this off, When I'm doing well, it's not merely that I'm not telling people what to do. It's that I internally don't think I know better what they should do. It's like, I'm not them. I'm not living their life. I'm happy to offer whatever ideas occur to me, but it's like, oh my God, they're the best judge of what they can do for themselves. That's what they need to do. And I have to respect that. So the initial phase is a lot of shock. Forgiveness, what I mean by forgiveness, there's basically, oversimplifying here, I'm sure, but there's basically two ways that people use the term forgive. And they're both common use, right? A common way of using the term forgive, it's like, oh, you owe me $50, I forgive that debt, which is to say, forget about it. It's like, yeah, we don't have to worry about it anymore. It's irrelevant, which implies, by the way, our relationship is back where it was before I loaned you the money. It's fine. I don't care. It's fine, whatever. That's a form of forgiveness. Forgiveness in the sense of cheating, to forgive would mean not only that you're not freaked out when you're talking to the person anymore, it would mean that you can restore the relationship. Well, I forgive you so we can stay married. I forgive you so you can still stay working for my company even though you embezzled, or whatever. And because my book doesn't just talk about betrayal in the context of marriage or couple relationships. It's more general than that.
Mm.
But yeah, most of the examples are couples, but there's a bunch of different ones. Actually, not only couples, family relationships, parent, child, and siblings and things like that. So that's how people often use the word forgive. I forgive you, we can restore the relationship. I don't like that use of forgiveness. I like the other one, which is to say, no, forgiveness is an inside job, which is to say, if I forgive someone who hurt me, it just means I'm not freaking the fuck out when I think about it anymore. I'm not angry. I'm not trusting, by the way. Trust is a whole different issue. I may forgive someone, and I have an example in the book. It's one of my go-to examples, a woman I met probably 25 years ago who I never met her ex who was in jail, in prison. The reason he was in prison is that he had been unbelievably brutal to her and their children and threatened to kill her if she said anything. She finally was able to get free and he got put in jail. But she was under no illusions that this guy was safe because he showed no remorse whatever. And so when he got out, she had a gun she kept by her bed. I mean, she was prepared to use it, but she forgave him. She didn't condone anything he did. She didn't say, "Oh, it was no big deal." She just said he was nuts. I'm not pissed anymore. I don't trust him as far as I can throw him, but I never want to see him again, but I can forgive him. She wasn't burdened by anger anymore. And indeed, she could think more clearly for the fact that she wasn't burdened by anger. She could think clearly about, well, geez, I can't trust the guy. I can't believe him, but I don't have to be pissed when I think about him. That's what I mean by forgiveness. So that's lots of people get there, not everybody. And I make it sound like it's sort of black and white, and it isn't. But when I talk about that forgiveness in that style, I have a whole section of the book where I talk about 3 steps to forgiveness, and I'll briefly talk about each of the 3. And the first one, I think inevitably, the first one always is forgive yourself. Now, wait a minute. If somebody, why should that wife you talked about have to forgive the no good cheating bastard of her husband? I mean, why should she have to forgive herself when he's the one who did that? Well, because she's probably thinking, shit, I should have realized this. I should have picked it up. I shouldn't have believed him. I shouldn't have let myself get hurt this way. I should have known that he was unhappy, or I should have known he was an asshole. Who knows? She's going to blame herself in part. That's what we do because there's good evolutionary reason why we do that. If we didn't blame ourselves, we would think the world is completely out of our control instead of just mostly out of our control. Children who are sexually abused typically blame themselves, even though as adults, they'll think back. So, somebody's sexually abused at 3 years old and they're blaming themselves. I should have stopped it. At 3? Are you serious? You know better. Yeah, rationally they know better, but emotionally they don't because that's the only way that child coped with the world. It's like, oh my God, if these are this is my father or my parents or whatever, if they're not protecting me, I'm screwed. Now, they're not thinking this consciously, but so they'd rather blame themselves. Oh, it must be because I'm bad. So forgive yourself is always the first step. And how do you forgive yourself? That's not so easy. Well, what is it to not beat up on yourself? What it is, and again, I'll use that example of the woman you described in your story there. How could she forgive herself for this? Well, she could start by saying, well, you know what? If I had known, I would have brought it up, or I would have acted differently. I would have prevented it. I would have done something. But I didn't know. I was who I was then. I knew what I knew, and I didn't know what I didn't know. I guess I was doing the best I could. That's the key. If you get to that point, it's like, well, shit, I wish it had been different, but I didn't know. So I was doing the best I could. Now I'll know better. Now I'll know what to look for. I've learned from this, but I was doing the best I could. So step one is forgive yourself. Now, step two, how do you forgive the no good cheating skunk that did what he did? Step two is a real simple extension of step one. If I forgive myself, if I'm saying, I wish I had known, but I can see I didn't know. I mean, I was doing the best I could. I didn't know what I didn't know. And then I think about him and I'm thinking, oh shit, he was doing the best he could too. I don't think he's fundamentally evil. If I do, I'll divorce him. But I don't think he's fundamentally evil. I suspect what went on was he was confused. I was confused. He got led along. I know how that works. I mean, I've done bad things in my life. I haven't cheated, but everybody can say that. I fucked up. Who hasn't? It's like I look back and say, what kind of a jerk was I? Well, I wasn't a jerk. Maybe I was just ignorant. Who knows? I didn't know what I didn't know. Well, you know what? That was true of him too. So that's how somebody can get to say, oh my God, I don't have to look at him as pure evil. Now, I still don't know if I can trust him, but I don't have to look at him as pure evil. That's step two. That's forgiving someone. It's like I don't have to be angry anymore. Now I have to figure out, all right, what do I want to do about this relationship? That's a whole other section of the book. It's like, oh shit, how do I get to trust? I don't know if I can trust him. In fact, I've got pretty good reason to think I can't, but at least I don't have to be consumed with anger and, trauma when I think about it. So that stage takes a while to get to. I don't have any numbers on that. It varies. There are people who get to it quickly and people who take years. That's step two. Step three, I claim, is every bit as important, and it sounds like an odd step. What I call it is forgive God. Now, what do I mean by forgive God? First of all, you don't have to be religious to appreciate this concept. Forgive God, it just means forgive the fact that this kind of shit happens. And that really is central to my concept of faith. It's like I could be angry at the universe and say, or angry at God, let's say. I could say, how could you let this sort of thing happen? How could you let good people be hurt so badly? Even the guy who cheated on me, how could you let him be so stupid? Because he's hurt too. I even recognize that. I've forgiven him. How could you just be angry at the universe? And forgiving God is when you get to the point of saying, well, shit, you know what? Cheating is sort of, if we couldn't cheat, we couldn't really love the way we love. You know what I mean? This is like the theologian thing about if you can't do evil, then there's no such good doesn't mean anything. In Jewish tradition or mythology or whatever you want to call it about like angels, angels are beings that have an assignment, but they have no choice of good or evil. They're not human. You know what I mean? They have no choice. They can only do what they're assigned to do. That's all they can do. So, it's like that sucks. Sucks to be them. Whatever. But, and again, I'm not taking that literally, but it's that concept that says, well, okay, I can forgive God for the fact that like, how do you forgive God for tsunamis? You remember that huge tsunami that happened like 20 years ago? Oh my God. You know, all these and nobody was doing anything wrong and they get swept away. I don't know, but it seems like tectonic plates are how this world works, and tsunamis go along with that. Death goes along with living. Living wouldn't work well without death. And when it happens in the grand scheme of things, yeah, it always happens too soon, but it has to happen. And again, I'm not saying be callous about it. I'm just saying, shit, we kind of have to accept the reality of life is what
Reality.
it is. And when
Yeah.
we accept that with some degree of some sense of a mindset that says, yeah, it's right to be that way, even when it sucks. That's what forgiving God means. So that was a long-winded answer to your question. Gee, is it possible to forgive? Yeah, it is. It takes a while. It takes work. It takes, what I hope therapy offers people in that is a pathway that opens up those doors that they otherwise wouldn't be able to see.
In in AA, when you have to do your 12 steps and you're going through all the stuff you got to go through with that is the amends part. I don't
Mhm.
remember if it's step 4, step 5 now. I can't remember which one it is. But so you have to write a letter to everyone that you technically hurt or hurt
Yep.
you. throughout your life. Dear Mr. Drug Dealer, I'm sorry that I bought meth from you and then fucked everything over, and now I, right? It's like, what? Well, yeah,
Yeah.
we have to literally write amends to everybody because they say I had a part in this. I didn't
Yes.
have to pick up that pipe the first time.
Yep.
Right. Then I didn't have to sleep with the guy to get drugs. And then I didn't have to go steal my parents' car and sell it to get drugs. I
Yep.
had a part in all of this as much as I want to be the victim. If you really look at it, now I'm not blaming the wife for a husband that cheats.
Yeah. Right.
However, perhaps there is a piece of that where the wife can look and say, I've kind of sucked as a wife the last couple of years. He
It's
was trying, he
yes.
was giving, and finally he just said, "Ah, fuck it. She's hot. She's got a tight skirt. Let's go." I mean, what do you think about that
Oh,
concept when you're dealing with that?
absolutely. And that's always it's a difficult, it's almost like a stage. I don't want to oversimplify it, you know what I mean? Or it's not black and white, but it's like a stage you have to go through. There are moments, and this has come up a lot in sessions when I think about it, where I will often point that out to like the wife in this story, and I'll say, there's an aspect of this that is, you could well say is just monstrously unfair, but real nonetheless, which is at a certain point, you have to recognize that you were indeed part of the context here. That doesn't condone somebody doing bad. It's not about saying, because if you do that too soon, you get, well, you're just offering excuses. And it's important, that it doesn't work well for somebody unless the person who did the cheating is really owning what they did, which is not so simple, by the way.
Yeah.
But when you can get into it, thinking about the context, it isn't necessarily they did anything wrong, but they were part of the context. And exactly what you said, very often people will come around to say, I really wasn't much of a wife, was I? And now that I think of it, I think about a couple I worked with a few years ago that I actually write about in the book. It was it's fascinating. At the last session we had, and we knew it was the last session because they were leaving town. This was pre telehealth. I started doing telehealth with the pandemic, actually, like so many people did. And I just
Yeah.
kept doing it because I really like it.
It's
But,
great.
incredibly convenient. But this was before that. And they were leaving town. They'd done amazing work. I'd worked with them for about a year and a half, I think. When they first came in, she had just found out about his infidelity. She was a mess. She had lost 30 pounds in God knows a short time, and it wasn't a good idea. You know what I mean? It's like, oh my God. So she was a mess. She was a mess. He felt terrible. Anyway, they did amazing work. He figured out he started going to AA. He figured out that alcohol was part of his issue. Never claimed, oh, I only did it because I was drunk. That was not true. He was really good about owning what he did. Anyway, all of that happened. So we finally get to this session. It's a goodbye session, and they're just reviewing how much better their lives are. And she was saying, it's amazing how much better off my life is, referring to her own life. My life is now, not just his, but our marriage is way better. We love each other in a way we never really did. That's another thing, by the way, that if people come in saying we just want to go back to how it was, no, they don't. They may think they do, but how it was is what led to where they were. No, you don't, and it is impossible to do that unless they, what was that? The eternal something of the spotless mind or something where they wipe out their memories.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Even in the movie, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Doesn't work. But what she said to her husband in that last session was, "Hey, thanks for taking one for the team."
Hmm.
And he said, "What do you mean by that?" And she smiled and she said, "Well, you're the one who had to feel guilty. We are so much better off, and you're the one who did the cheating." Hey, she didn't say thanks for cheating. Never heard anybody say that. But she said, "Thanks for being the one who had to feel like, you did the bad thing." Right. And she was smiling when she said it because she was realizing, yeah, I was pretty crummy wife too, wasn't I? Go
I
figure.
like to I like to affectionately call it getting kicked in the nuts.
Yeah, yeah.
When my first wife and I, we went through a lot of struggles, just in business, with kids, with life, different things that went on and on. You're together 28 years starting when you're 18. You're going to go through a lot of different growing pains and a lot of different shit. And
Yeah.
neither one of us, had infidelity or anything like that, which is tough. But I was a jerk. I'd get drunk at parties and be stupid. I mean, I did some stupid shit.
Mhm.
She put up with a lot of stuff with me. I could be a real knucklehead. Um, but the thing was when it was always like, life really kicked us in the nuts.
Mm,
And let you go get a bag of peas, and then I'll sit on the couch, and let's heal this. Let's work this do this together. Because there's one thing that we always had, and it was we were absolutely each other's best friend.
yes.
And there was
Yeah.
a lot of shit that could go by and that
Hmm.
we could work on together because of the communication and the fact that we really loved each other and we really liked each other.
Well,
And
and you're
just made
describing what I
things,
call kinship.
huh?
You're describing what I call kinship. When I say be kind, that's what
Mm,
you're describing. You were each other's best friend. You loved each other and you liked each other, and that's a prescription for a marriage that works. Do you know what I
yeah.
mean? Because you had that sense of kinship that
Yeah.
even when you
Yeah,
were knucklehead,
we did. I mean, it
yeah,
was good, but still, you had a lot of shit, and
yeah,
I did. You'd say, "Wow," like I said, yeah, boy, life will kick you in the nuts, and you deal with that shit. So I love that gal saying you took one for the team. I
yeah.
don't forgive your ass, that's for sure. But you know what? We came out through it on the other side, and we're
Well, yeah.
better
And in that
for it.
sense, she did forgive his ass. Do you know what I mean? It's like she didn't say it was right. That's what I'm saying. It wasn't forgiveness in the sense of, oh, it was no big deal. No, it was a huge big deal. And he knew it was wrong and she knew it was wrong. There was never an argument about that. But they had an understand they put it in perspective. It's like, oh wow, isn't that something? Where you need to get to be able to trust someone, which is again that step after forgiveness. To be able to get there, you have to be able to recognize, you have to be able to understand it's possible for a decent person that you could actually believe in to do pretty bad shit. And I'm not saying that applies to everybody all times. I remember a couple I worked with a few years ago where he had cheated and they had done a lot of work around forgiveness. And I think she had reached a point where she said, I'm not angry anymore, but I can't stay married to somebody who had cheated on me. It just didn't fit her understanding of marriage. I respect that. It made sense. It's like, no, she wasn't going to be angry with them. They had kids. I think I don't know. After our work, I don't know what happened to them the past few years, but I'm guessing they do okay co-parenting their kids. But she just couldn't stay with someone who would have done that to her. It just didn't fit her understanding of what marriage was. And, that happens sometimes too. But I'd still say forgiveness is important in that sense too, because they still had a relationship they had to have. And it's good when people can get there. The trust part is really all about that sense of, wow, look, trust. Another interesting that happens when you go through betrayal and come out the other side is you now recognize that if you had the illusion that someone you love could never hurt you, that was always an illusion. Anybody you love could hurt you. I'm not saying huge betrayal like hurt. That's why I was talking earlier about annoyance. They're going to annoy you. You're going to annoy them. But
Yeah.
you can get hurt by even a basically good person. Basically good people do bad shit sometimes. I'm not
Yeah.
condoning it, but I'm observing. Yeah, if you just write them off as, it's so many things. I see these when I post videos, like clips of our podcast and stuff like that. And anytime we're talking about infidelity, and there will be comments that will say, you can never trust anybody who's ever cheated. Once a cheater, always a cheater.
Mhm.
It isn't true. Sometimes it's true. It's not that it's never true. Yes, there are some people, it's like, oh my God, don't try to be in a monogamous relationship with this person. They don't seem to want monogamy. They just seem to want what they want. And I don't even mean that in a negative sense. It's like, yeah, there's some folks who just aren't cut out for monogamy, it would appear. Fair enough. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not denying it. Don't try to be in a monogamous marriage with that person because you'll probably get hurt. But many, many, many people come in my office and I believe their sincerity when they say this. They say, actually, both parties. One will say, I never would have thought in a million years that if my husband cheated on me, I would be willing to work on it. And yet here I am. And the other will say, I never would have believed in a million years I'd cheat on my wife. And yet here I am. And yep, there they are, And
Yeah.
when you can actually work with that, sometimes it is possible for trust to be restored, and they're better off for it. That's the thing. It's like the woman saying, thanks for taking one for the team. Never heard anybody say thanks for cheating, but lots of people have said, wow, the shit needed to hit the fan, and we're better off that it did. Something
And
had to
now I
happen.
remember now I remember why I loved you in the first place, and we put everything back together and try to get there. But Doc, you've been amazing. We just blew past 2 hours like it was nothing. So I got to finish with one question, if you'll
Sure.
allow me. I always ask one question when I sign off on these things, and could be about anything really. I just say, like to ask if there's one thing you'd like to leave our guests with, a thought that you have, a saying that you have, a philosophy, whatever. I mean, if you have something that means something to Dr. Sharma that you'd like to leave us with, what would that one thought be?
Oh, that's a hanging curveball over the plate. I'll hit that one out, right? Because I've already talked about it. It's my 7 words, right? So why we call it the podcast. A little plug here for the podcast that I do with my wife, Judy Alexander, couples therapy in 7 words. And the 7 words are what I'll answer your question with: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And that's not like, oh, that tells you what to do, and then, you don't have to think about it. No, you need to think about each of those 3 principles. But be kind, don't panic, and have faith is my way of summarizing how I like to think about this stuff.
Yeah, I love that. That's easy. Yeah, that was good. Now I got to get the mug. All right, Doc. Everybody, you have just been exposed to the amazing Dr. Bruce Chalmer. Dr. Chalmer, this is a lot of fun. This 2 hours just blazed by. I mean, and we didn't even scratch the surface of what you've got cooking. So, we've got the 3 books. We've got Regaining the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back. We've got the It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong. And our newest, latest, and greatest book is Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. So much there, Doc. You're amazing. This was a lot of fun. I thank you so much for being here.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun too.
Yeah, cool biz. All right, everybody. Well, you've just experienced Dr. Bruce Traumer on another episode of the What If You Could podcast. Please look for Dr. Traumer on, where can we find you, Doc?
BruceChalmer.com is probably the easiest way. The books are available anywhere books are sold. But if you go to BruceChalmer.com, you've got information about all that stuff, also about my practice. I do therapy and also, coaching practice as well. So it's all there on my website, BruceChalmer.com.
Awesome. Well, that's easy. And we'll post all that stuff on the end of this podcast. You'll be able to see it all on the website and stuff. So, everybody, thank you so much. And Dr. Sharma, it's been a pleasure. It really has. Thank you so much.
Thank
Talk to
you.
you soon. Thanks again for joining us on another episode of What If You Could podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and give us any feedback. We'd love to hear it. And remember, if you can dream it, you can do it. See you next time.